Congressman Chris Van Hollen was elected to Congress in 2002 to represent Maryland's 8th District, quickly became a member of the Democratic leadership, and then 2 years ago became the top Democrat on the House Budget Committee. Roll call has noted that, quote, Van Hollen gets near universal respect from his colleagues for his intellectual firepower and combination of policy and political chops. He was instrumental in getting the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act through Congress, which requires more frequent and more extensive lobbying disclosure. He also is the sponsor of the Disclose Act, which, among other things, would require some of the 501c4s and other groups we've been talking about today to reveal the sources of their funds. And he also filed a lawsuit challenging the FEC for allowing groups running issue ads close to the election to not disclose who is funding those ads. He won the case at the district and appellate court levels. I'm sure he'll update us on what's going on with it now. Before his election to the House, Congressman Van Hollen served for years in the Maryland House of Delegates and for 8 years in the Maryland Senate. He's a graduate of Swarthmore College, the John Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, and the Georgetown University Law Center. He also happens to be my congressman. Welcome and thank you, Congressman.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm really pleased that even after redistricting, you're still a constituent in the state of Maryland. And let me thank the Center for Responsive Politics for organizing this very important forum today, focusing on the issues of transparency and accountability that go to the heart of our democracy. I also want to thank the work that you and OpenSecrets.org do in terms of tracking money in politics. As today's forum suggests, that's becoming increasingly difficult. And I think the focus of today's forum, which is the growing threat to the health of our democracy, of the huge amount of secret money that is spent to influence the outcome of federal elections, is something that we really need to focus on, and the American people need to understand very clearly what's going on. I'm sure there have been lots of discussions today about the different Supreme Court cases, but the two decisions, Citizens United and its offspring, Speech Now, took what I think was already a broken campaign finance system and made it worse. Those cases opened the floodgates to a gusher of special interest money from wealthy individuals, from corporations, and other entities. And I believe both those decisions were wrongly decided, but today I want to focus on the parts of those decisions with which I agree. Their reaffirmation of earlier Supreme Court rulings that disclosure requirements are important to our democracy and do not place an undue burden on free speech. Now, I wouldn't necessarily have spent as much time on the constitutionality and the public benefit of requiring the disclosure of the identities of individuals and corporations who are bankrolling TV ads to elect or defeat candidates. But since the Senate Republican leader, Mitch McConnell, last week launched an all-out political assault on the very idea and constitutionality of such disclosure, it is worth focusing on that issue for a little while. In his speech last week at AEI, Senator McConnell began a political attack on those who support greater transparency and disclosure in our election politics by arguing that the real goal of disclosure is to suppress political speech. Nothing could be further from the truth. Disclosure doesn't prevent any individual or any corporation or union from running a single political advertisement. It simply requires that voters be informed of who is financing those political advertisements. It is worth noting that the position Senator McConnell took last week represents a complete reversal from the position he took at the time he was fighting the campaign finance efforts of Senator McCain and Senator Feingold with respect to the 527 groups. At that time, Senator McConnell told Tim Russert on Meet the Press, and I quote, "Republicans are in favor of disclosure. If you're going to do that, and the Senate voted to do that, and I'm prepared to go down that road, then it needs to be meaningful disclosure. 527s are just a handful of groups. We need to have real disclosure. And so what we ought to do is broaden the disclosure to include at least labor unions and tax-exempt business associations and trial lawyers, so you include the major political players in America. Why would a little disclosure be better than a lot of disclosure? Senator McConnell asked. I agree with Senator McConnell. Back in 2000, yet in his speech last week at AEI, Senator McConnell tried to make the case that requiring the kind of disclosure he called for back in 2000 and requiring that donors disclose is an unconstitutional infringement of free speech, and he repeatedly invoked Justice Clarence Thomas's partial dissent in the Citizens United case, where Senator Thompson was the one justice who dissented from the portion of the Citizens United opinion that said not only was disclosure constitutional, but that it was an important public good. Indeed, the courts have expressly upheld disclosure requirements dating back to Buckley Vallejo, and those findings were reaffirmed in Citizens United and Speech Now. In Speech Now, the court said, and I quote, "The public has an interest in knowing who is speaking about a candidate and who is funding that speech, no matter whether the contributions were made toward administrative expenses or independent expenditures. Further, requiring disclosure of such information deters and helps expose violations of other campaign finance restrictions, such as those barring contributions from foreign corporations or individuals." So twin public goals: one, informing citizens; number two, ensuring that other campaign laws like those barring foreign contributions are not violated. Now, Senator McConnell argued last week that revealing the identities of these individuals would subject them to unfair criticism. He specifically mentioned the Koch brothers, who have spent millions of dollars trying to influence the outcome of elections, as people that had been exposed to that kind of unfair criticism. I am sure that the Koch brothers, I'm sure that George Soros, I'm sure that others who want to spend lots of money to influence political elections, as is their right, and we should have a robust election debate with lots of points of views. I'm sure that sometimes people say things that hurt their feelings. But that is no reason why we should deprive American voters of their right, I believe, to have that information, and certainly the important public purpose that is served, as the Supreme Court has said, by voters having that information. Indeed, as Justice Scalia pointed out in the 2010 case of Doe v. Reed, there are already laws against threats and intimidation. He pointed that out very clearly. But he also observed that, and I quote, "Harsh criticism, short of unlawful action, is a price our people have traditionally been willing to pay for self-governance. Requiring people to stand up in public for their political acts fosters civic courage, without which democracy is doomed." That's Justice Scalia. So I found it a little curious that in his speech, Senator McConnell said that all these efforts to push for more disclosure were part of a radical left-wing agenda. The senator last week said, for example, that pressure from left-wing groups is making some corporations begin to notify their shareholders when those corporations are making political contributions. Heaven forbid that corporations should be asked to notify their shareholders, their owners, about the political contributions and political expenditures they're making. Hardly a left-wing idea. In fact, here's what Justice Scalia, Justice Alito, and the others in Citizens United had to say about that, and I quote, "With the advent of the internet, prompt disclosure of expenditures can provide shareholders and citizens with the information needed to hold corporations and elected officials accountable for their positions and supporters. Shareholders can determine whether their corporation's political speech advances the corporation's interest in making profits, and citizens can see whether elected officials are, quote, in the pocket of so-called moneyed interests, unquote. Again, that's from the majority opinion, in fact, in Citizens United. I think it's very clear that the values of transparency and accountability are not some left-wing agenda. These are important American values. They're important to the health of our democracy. And that's why when you ask the American people, and you look at the surveys that have asked people about this issue, overwhelmingly, the American public supports the notion of transparency and disclosure. Republicans, Democrats, independents, people who are not affiliated with any party support that because they recognize it's important to a healthy democracy. And that's why in 2010, I and many of my colleagues introduced the Disclose Act in the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives passed the Disclose Act. The Disclose Act required that these individuals, corporations, unions, others spending money to influence elections tell voters who is bankrolling their television ads and their other political advertisements. Very simple idea. That passed the House, as I said. Unfortunately, in September 2010, it was defeated in the Senate on a procedural motion. 59 out of the 100 senators supported the Disclose Act, but as everybody here who are close observers of Congress knows, in the Senate, in order to get a final vote on the bill, you need to overcome a filibuster. Republicans filibustered the Disclose Act. Senator McConnell led the Republicans in filibustering the Disclose Act. And because Ted Kennedy had died earlier that year, and he would have been the 60th vote, we only got 59 out of 100. Scott Brown voted against cloture, and therefore, even though the Disclose Act had a large majority in the Senate, it did not have enough to overcome filibuster and procedural delay. The reasons for the Disclose Act are more important today than ever. That's why we've reintroduced the Disclose Act in the House. That's why Senator Sheldon Whitehouse has introduced the Disclose Act in the Senate. And the work of the Center for Responsive Politics shows that there's a growing need for the Disclose Act, because what we've seen in the aftermath of Citizens United and Speech Now is that the previous disclosure laws that we had are totally inadequate. They were inadequate before Citizens United and Speech Now, but the pressures created by those decisions in terms of the way people are contributing and making political expenditures has, in fact, highlighted the real weaknesses of our disclosure laws. So what you're finding now is that super PACs, while you hear a lot about them, are not going to be the vehicle of choice for a majority of the money that's going to flow into political elections. In fact, the studies that the Center of Responsive Politics and others show that in the 2010 elections, in fact, more money flowed into elections through 501c4s, 501c6s, than flowed through super PACs. Why? Because super PAC contributions are disclosed. The donors are disclosed to the public. It's not timely disclosure, and one of the things the Disclose Act would do is make those contributions to super PACs disclosed in a more timely manner, but disclosure ultimately happens through FEC reporting. But if you contribute to a 501c4 organization, for example, like Crossroads GPS, or any other C4 organization, or you contribute to the Chamber of Commerce, a 501c6 organization, those contributions are not made public. And what the data from the 2010 election shows is that more money, as I said, flowed into these elections through 501c4s and 501c6s. And in fact, the reasons been pretty clear, and if you go to the websites of a lot of organizations, they'll say right out there, you know, you do not have to have your contributions disclosed, so people who want to pump secret money into campaigns will use these groups as the vehicle of choice. Now, just in the last few weeks, there was a decision that came out of the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. The case was The Real Truth About Obama versus the FEC, and the court found that the FEC should apply what's called the primary purpose test to determine whether these organizations were, in fact, political organizations masquerading as educational and charitable organizations. And I think if you look at a lot of the public data, it's pretty clear that the primary purpose of a lot of these groups is to influence the outcome of the elections and for a very clear political purpose. And so this is an issue the FEC should look at. This is an issue that the IRS should look at to see whether or not these groups are abusing their tax status. Now, Senator McConnell says the administration is using the IRS as some kind of, a vehicle to go after its political opponents. That is a bunch of nonsense. What's happening is Senator McConnell is trying to pressure the IRS into not doing its job in revealing that some of these organizations are masquerading as educational charitable organizations, and they're being used for political purposes under the guise of educational and charitable organizations. And they're being used for that purpose because there are lots of people that want to hide their money in politics. So it's very important to look at that. The last point I want to make, and then I'm happy to try and answer any questions you've got, relates to the case that I brought against the FEC last year. And what the case we made was that the disclosure regulations that the FEC had put forward to comply with the statute on disclosure fell short of the requirements of the statute. In other words, the way the FEC interpreted the statute illegally narrowed the scope of what had to be disclosed when you run what are known as electioneering communication ads, EC ads, issue ads within certain time periods of primary elections and general elections. And the district court found in favor of our argument, and the Court of Appeals, the appellate court, denied a request for an injunction from the opponents of that. So that opinion and decision as of today stands. And that will put pressure on some of these groups that are using the guise of charitable educational organizations as a way to hide their political donations and expenditures. And the reason it will do that is what the court found was that these issue ads, which are often in the form of sham issue ads, this was, of course, a big part of the debate back during McCain-Feingold, that if these organizations now run those issue ads within the windows, the 60-day and 90-day windows, they will be required to disclose the source of financing. And the reason it will create some pressure for these organizations is that, by all accounts and by all the information we've been able to gather, those organizations have not been counting those expenditures on issue ads as political. They've been counting those under the umbrella of educational expenditures. So a lot of these hard-hitting issue ads aimed at trying to elect or defeat a candidate, but without specifically saying elect or defeat a candidate, have been put on the books of these organizations not as political expenditures, but as charitable educational expenditures. And to the extent that they now have to report those, they would then, they have to choose. Either they actually disclose them, they don't run them, or they switch to running harder-hitting IE ads, which are very clearly political, and there's no question about whether or not they can be classified. I know it's a little complicated, but the bottom line here is that these organizations are doing all sorts of gymnastics to try to prevent voters from knowing the sources of their funding and prevent voters from knowing who is bankrolling those campaigns. And the proposition behind the Disclose Act is a very simple one. If you've got nothing to hide, you should have nothing to fear from transparency. As Justice Scalia said, our democracy is strengthened when all of us participate openly in the political process, and that when people are deciding to use money to try and influence voters' decisions in an election, voters have a right to know who's financing those, and there's a very important public interest and public good advanced by those disclosure requirements. And I'll just close by saying again, while I disagreed with lots of the parts of Citizens United in speech now, those courts by large majorities, in fact 8-1, upheld the idea that disclosure requirements are not only consistent with First Amendment rights, but they serve a very important purpose in strengthening our democracy. And I am confident that at the end of the day, we will prevail on this issue of transparency and disclosure because the American people overwhelmingly support it. People recognize that it's important to the health of our democracy. So the question is not whether we will prevail when it comes to transparency. The question is when, and that's a matter that's going to be left to the American people, but it is our responsibility, all of us who care about the health of our democracy, to help inform the American people about what's going on and what's at stake. So thank you very much for having me today. I'd be delighted to try and answer any questions you got.
If I could just remind everyone to state your name and affiliation when you ask your question, and we have our mic runners, so wait for the mic. Over there.
Sure.
You, yesterday, as I'm sure you know, President Obama's lawyer asked for the FEC, I believe, to check on Crossroads' tax-exempt status. Do you believe that Priorities USA should also report its donors?
I believe all these organizations should be subject to disclosure. That's why I'm pushing for the Disclose Act, which would require all of them to disclose. And I think the FEC should determine whether or not these organizations are, in fact, political organizations or not. So, yeah, I think this should apply to all organizations. The FEC should look at them through the FEC's own two-pronged test that it's laid out. And that's what the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals said the other day, that the FEC should determine whether or not these organizations are political organizations, which would require them to disclose just like super PACs have to disclose, or whether or not they're really educational and charitable organizations.
Jane? Wait 1 second.
Jane Mayer from the New Yorker magazine. Anyway, I just wanted to know what would it take, do you think, to get your legislation through Congress at this point?
Right.
And what reason is there to think it might? Do you need to change the bill in some way, or just change the makeup of the Congress, or pray for a miracle? I mean, what is it?
Right, all of the above. Well, maybe all of the above. No, let me thank you for the question. I hope that the Senate will take up the bill. I think that the more attention that's focused on the issue, the greater the chance that we will pass disclosure requirements because, as I said, it's clear the overwhelming majority of the American people support that. There's a majority in the Senate that's in favor of it, but as I indicated, you've got Senator McConnell and Republicans opposing it, even though they were for it before they were against it. And so in order to get it through the Senate, obviously we need to muster the political pressure from the American people to get it done. We're happy to look at any suggestions any of our colleagues have with respect to amending it, so long as it doesn't violate the primary purpose of disclosure. And then, of course, in the House, despite the fact that Speaker Boehner also has said that sunlight is the best disinfectant, there's no indication that the House Republican leadership will bring up the disclosed bill we passed. So our approach is to pursue a number of strategies. One is to keep up the political pressure in the House and the Senate, knowing that the Republicans oppose it, but also knowing that the American people support it. Number two, continue to pursue a legal strategy. As I indicated, the case that I brought against the FEC is now going to put more pressure on these groups to disclose. They're all looking hard for ways to avoid telling the American people who's financing their ads, but we will continue a legal strategy as well as we go forward.
Okay. Yeah. And I'm told you need to hold the mic close so that
Eliza Newland Carney from Roll Call. Congressman Van Hollen, Republicans say the Disclose Act is uneven because it doesn't require disclosure from labor unions. Is that correct?
It's just not the case. If you look at the bill that we introduced in the Senate, if you look at the bill Sheldon Whitehouse has introduced, it applies across the board. There's no provision that says unions are exempted or anything like that. It's an argument that's a dated argument. There were some provisions that people pointed to in some of the earlier versions of Disclose Act that, while I disagreed with their characterization, I understood why they might try and make that argument. But that argument does not apply in any way to the bills that have been introduced. Yes.
Hi, Dan Frumkin from the Huffington Post. I was wondering, did you anticipate that the success of your lawsuit would result in what it did, which was basically these groups sort of thumbing their noses at you and saying, well, we'll just move the money from ECs to IEs or what have you? And at some point, do you think they've become too clever for their own good?
Well, I think they're already becoming too clever for their own good, and I think that you can see by the fact that they are submitting all sorts of questions to the FEC that they are trying to figure out their way through this thicket that they themselves have created by trying to take advantage of these charitable organizations, essentially, hijacking the form of an educational charitable organization for political purposes. With respect to the other part of your question, I don't want to get into all the details, but there were legal reasons that we had to pursue the FEC regulations regarding the electioneering communication statute before we could look at challenging their regulations with respect to the IE statute. I don't want to get into all the details, but as I indicated in response to the earlier question, it's part of an ongoing strategy. But I do believe that to the extent that people run IE ads instead of EC ads, and I apologize for people who are not initiated in all these areas, but to the extent that they do that, some groups will risk alienating their membership. So, for example, the Chamber of Commerce has said that it's determined not to disclose the sources of its funding for the campaign ads they run. Chamber of Commerce is one of the largest funders of political advertisements, one of the largest secret funders of political advertisements. They recognize, and most of their ads are run in the form of very hard-hitting issue ads. So their ads don't usually end with the words, elect Congressman X or defeat Congressman X. And they're usually in the form of these very hard-hitting issue ads, which have been in the past referred to as sham issue ads. But nevertheless, I think there are some members of the Chamber of Commerce who may become a little more uncomfortable when the Chamber can no longer argue that its ads are focused on issues that the Chamber cares about, but they're focused directly on the defeat or election of a particular candidate, because that then removes the thin veil of deniability that it's just purely a question of issues that the ads are dealing with.
I think we have time for just one more question, if there is one. How about in the back over here?
Congressman, on your disclose bill, how long do you think a group that's running, whether it's a genuine issue ad or a sham issue ad, how much of the advertisement, say if it's a radio ad, 15 or 30 seconds, should be spent on the disclaimer describing the organization running the ad?
Well, I'm not sure there has to be a set amount of time, but I think that it should be sufficient for the listener to know something about the organization. You put your finger on an issue which I think are one of the parts of the bill that could be amended but I stress without losing the importance of disclosing the identity of the organization. So I think disclosure is important enough that people who are running these ads can use a few seconds of their ads to tell people the name of the organization and some of the top funders of the organization.
The bill that you have actually has a disclaimer that runs about 20 seconds or more. And so I was wondering, on a 30-second ad, is there something that you would add to the bill to limit the number of seconds that would have to be used?
Well, I don't think the bill requires that it be 20 seconds worth of ads, worth of disclaimer. But I do think that we need to strike a balance, and I'm happy to sit down with any of our colleagues, Republican or Democrats, to deal with those kind of details. From Senator McConnell's speech the other day at AEI, it doesn't sound like he's interested in negotiating that kind of details. He apparently is fundamentally opposed to the idea that voters should be informed about who's paying for ads. So he not only has he's launched a full broadside against the issue, even though just 12 years ago he was the guy saying we need to disclose more, not less. So I'm happy to sit down with anybody who is interested in disclosure and transparency and making sure voters get that information, to talk to them about the best and most effective way of balancing different interests.
Could you just give us your name for?
David Keating, Center for Competitive Policy.
Great.
I'd be happy to sit down with you and explain the disclaimer in the bill and perhaps work with you to make it more affordable for groups that can't afford 1-minute long ads.
Well, I'm happy to do that. I wouldn't want to. I would be happy to sit down with the understanding that if we resolve that issue, the rest of the bill is fine. I mean, So anyway, I'm more than happy to sit down with anybody who's genuinely also interested in disclosure at the end of the day. Are you?
Certain types of disclosures, sure.
No, I mean, I know you're asking the questions, but since you asked me about working on a particular part of the bill, I mean, I would just ask you whether you think that the quote I gave from Scalia was correct.
It sounded like you quoted him properly.
Yeah, no.
Okay.
I'm going to interpret that as you don't agree with the Scalia, all right? Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Congressman Van Hollen. So
Thank you very much. Thank you.
so much.
If I could just, I did want to just recognize and thank Karen Robb with my office. Those of you who work on these issues know that she's an important part of the effort. All right, thanks.